And do I just start? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so thank you everyone for coming today and listening to our presentation today. We're going to talk a bit about the housing crisis and also about the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, what we're doing in order to combat the issues that come from the housing crisis. So first, I'll start off with just giving a little framework of the housing crisis. So right now, even before COVID, because right now we're seeing a lot of exacerbation of the housing crisis because of COVID-19, but even prior to COVID-19, there was a housing crisis. Housing costs have just become so enormous over decades, and that a lot of that has to do with the federal government not being as involved as they should be in these matters of the housing crisis. So just some stats to start us off when we're talking about what the housing crisis looks like. 1 in 4 families that are eligible for assistance cannot get assistance for their housing needs. We're also talking about 71% of extremely low income renters are severely cost burdened. And what we mean by that is that they're spending more than half of their income on rental costs, which means that they have less money for food, for healthcare, for childcare. The another thing that we're talking about when we talk about the housing crisis is that in no county across the US, and we're talking about 3,000 counties across the US, can a minimum wage earner afford a 2-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. So that's nowhere across the US. And again, we're talking about 3,000 counties where that applies. So when we're talking about the housing crisis, we're talking about people who are literally being priced out of housing and housing just being out of reach for so many people, and costs not associated with housing being a factor in which they cannot pay for certain necessities in life. And so what we're doing through the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign is we're advocating for housing resources for the lowest income renter, but through this multi-sector lens. So here on this page, you'll see that we have the campaign's vision and mission, and I'll just read out the mission for you. So we're building a movement of stakeholders from many sectors to generate widespread support for federal policies that correct long-standing racial inequities and economic injustices by ensuring quality housing for people with low incomes. So really what we're doing is we're bringing in sectors from all over. We're talking about education, healthcare, civil rights, all across the board to really advocate for housing policy. And the reason that we're doing this is 2 reasons. One is that the housing crisis has reached enormous heights, and we have to tackle the issue, and housers can no longer do this work alone. And also that other sectors are recognizing that without affordable housing, they cannot achieve their own goals and priorities. So a lot of what we talk about throughout the campaign are these intersections between housing and health, housing and education, housing and economic mobility. That really the foundation of what opportunities and resources that people can access really comes from what neighborhood you live in. And that's unfortunate, right? Like being lucky enough to be born in a certain zip code affords you certain opportunities, and that really shouldn't be the case, right? And so we're advocating for housing and also showing how housing has a spillover impact on all these different areas. And having voices that are not typical housing voices truly helps us, because it shows that it's not just a housing organization talking about these issues. And through the campaign, we aim to educate the public, policymakers, change policy, talk to opinion leaders, and really push this issue so that housing is really a conversation that we have on the national level, and we really tackle this crisis so that people can be stably housed and can access housing. And so how we do that through the campaign is through our partnerships. This is one of the partnerships that we have, and this is probably, this is our advisory board. So we have a steering committee of 19 organizations who are fully committed to the campaign. They have completely endorsed our policy agenda. And as you can see on the screen, these are not bread and butter housing organizations. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition, they chair the steering committee, but you'll see other groups on here. We have the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Children's Health Watch, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Catholic Charities USA, Children's Defense Fund, Community Catalyst, Food Research and Action Center, the National Women's Law Center, Just Leadership USA, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the National Association of Community Health Centers, NAACP, National Education Association, the National LGBTQ Task Force, the National Association of Social Workers, National League of Cities, Unidos US, also the National Resource Defense Council. And so with these organizations that are not typical, again, housing organizations, you see a different voice being brought to policymakers in order to advance federal housing policy. And it really makes an impact. So if we have a sign-on letter that's asking for money to put in a housing resource like vouchers or the National Housing Trust Fund, if that letter is signed from organizations that are not typical housing organizations, again, seeing the NAACP on that letter, or the Food Research and Action Center on that letter, or Children's Health Watch on that letter, it's really an indicator to anyone reading the letter, especially we're sending it to policymakers, that this issue goes beyond housing alone. And so that is our steering committee. Another way in which we build these partnerships and we build on the intersections between housing and all these different sectors is through our roundtable. So when we launched in 2018, we knew that we wanted to create a broader conversation, that we didn't want to limit it just to our steering committee, that really we wanted to really broaden this issue so that all these organizations can start seeing their connection between their work and housing policy. And so I'm sorry, I think that you may be hearing the vacuum upstairs. I'm really sorry about that. But the roundtable is really consisting of a large table. So it's to be from many different numbers of organizations can join our roundtable. And what our roundtable is focused on is just cross-sector dialogue at first. So organizations that join our roundtable join to basically have conversations around cross-sector engagement. And what they can do is they can get their involvement in our campaign wherever they see fit. So some organizations, they're ready, they're mobilized around our issue, they understand the intersections, they're ready to send our call to actions to their networks and all of that work. So we do have organizations that do that on the roundtable, but then we also have organizations on our roundtable that are just, they're curious. They want to know what their connections are. They haven't really explored it themselves. And so they're joining the roundtable in order to start the discussion, and a bunch of organizations that are in between. And what we find is that organizations that typically start off not really understanding the intersections, they get it really quickly. They start getting really involved with the campaign in different ways. And so here you just see a really big group of a bunch of different organizations. We have AARP on here, you have Prosperity Now on here, you have National Housing Trust, you have just a bunch of different organizations, Justice in Housing, Legal Action Center, Strive Together. So all these organizations, again, some of them most of them not housing organizations, coming together to really speak about housing issues. And then the last way that we do it through partnerships is through our state campaigns. So we knew that we could not alone, as a national organization, a national campaign, talk to policymakers about the issues, that they needed to hear from their own constituents on the ground, right? So we decided to give a bit of support to state campaigns in order for them to do the same work that we're doing, but on the state level. So these state campaigns, they build out state-based multi-sector coalitions. They kind of mirror the coalitions that we have on the national level, and then they use those partnerships in order to advance federal housing policy. So typically the groups that we've chosen to be state partners with us, sometimes they're typical housing organizations, or they focus in certain areas in the state, but their focus may be on state legislation and not really pivoting to the federal advocacy piece. And so we help them pivot those efforts to federal housing advocacy so that policymakers on the federal level can hear their constituents talk about how much we need housing resources on the federal level in order to drive what's happening at the state and local level. And they're tremendous in the campaign, tremendous support. They send sign-on letters with organizations that, have, again, it's organizations throughout the state with different focus, saying that we need more federal housing resources. They do big conferences where they bring multi-sector leaders to speak. Some of them do housing tours where they actually have speakers come in and talk about the multi-sector impact right there. They do big social media pushes that really amplify the multi-sector piece in our work. So our state campaigns are really built to, again, mirror the work that we do, but also to send a signal to policymakers that their own constituents are very much passionate about this issue, and not only housing or organizations in their state, but also all these other sectors that are coming together on the state level that's saying that we do need more resources on the federal level to address the housing crisis that's happening. And so this is a little bit outdated, but I am going to show you guys what our buckets that we asked for consist of. With COVID-19, a lot of the work that we did last year was really focused on bringing housing resources into those COVID-19 relief package. But even though some of the things that we asked for have been a little overshadowed by that, there's still big bucket issues that still are consistent today. And actually, with COVID-19 exacerbating a lot of these issues, they really have become prevalent in what we're talking about now, and really prominent in what we're asking for in a small ask to what we're asking for in these big buckets. So I'll take you through them. The first bucket, we really do talk about bridging the gap between rents and incomes through rental assistance. And what we're talking about in this bucket is providing vouchers for people, or a renter's tax credit for people. Vouchers give families the opportunity to move out their neighborhood if they would like to, or to find housing within their neighborhood. But it really creates that opportunity for them to use the assistance wherever they would like to. And then we've also heard, especially during the beginning of the presidential candidacy and trying to figure out what the next president would be, right? We were hearing a lot of different candidates come out talking about a renter's tax credit. So that's another subsidy that can be used in order to bridge the gap between rents and incomes. And in that second bucket, we talk about expanding the stock of deeply affordable housing. So in some places, there's just not the supply. There's not the supply of housing that's needed. And so you need to build housing in those areas. What we really recommend is putting more funding into the National Housing Trust Fund. It's a dedicated stream that really focuses on building low-income housing. We also talk about in this bucket doing new incentives for LIHTC so that they're a bit more targeted. They're a little bit more inclusive, really thinking about inclusive and diverse, economically diverse neighborhoods. And also in this bucket, we talk about preserving the units that's already there. So there are units that we have that year after year, there's no protections for them. They can be transformed into other buildings. And then again, we don't have the supply that we need of low income housing. So we ask to preserve those units as well in that bucket. And so in that third bucket, we move on to more prevention. So again, the way that we see this is like the bridge the gap is really the demand side, expanding the stock is really the supply side of the issue. And then we do a preventative side, which is thinking about the families that are really at the cusp, that if one economic shock happens to them, they tend to spiral. And that could be something like a broken down car or an unreimbursed medical bill, anything that might shock the income of this renter, and then now they can't pay for their rent. And so what we've been asking for is a program that really provides temporary emergency assistance for families so that they don't spiral and they don't need prolonged assistance. So this may come in the form of cash assistance that helps them pay off that one-time expense so that it doesn't, impact their ability to pay for housing. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about stabilizing homes, preventing them from spiraling if they incur any unexpected economic shocks there. So those are our three buckets. And again, the way that we talk about it to the people who we want partnerships with, we talk about it in these broad ways, the demand, supply, and prevention side, because we understand with our multi-sector partners that we have to keep it pretty broad based for us to move things forward. And we really see this campaign as an offensive campaign. So we don't do a lot of the defensive work, but we do try to move the conversation forward by asking for more funding, more money, a better look at some of these programs. And we keep it at the high level because we have such a multi-sector base that the policies, like we leave the wonky, weedy language to the housing experts that are in the space, but we try to keep it broad enough so that the broad coalition can understand the ask that we're trying to get from Congress. And so just touching a little bit on the COVID-19 housing ask that we had. So again, the focus a lot of last year was trying to get some COVID relief funding for housing in particular. So some of the things that we asked for, or our four main asks, was 100 billion for emergency rental assistance. We did see that in the last package, they included 25 billion for emergency rental assistance, which is a step. And so that really kind of goes into our third bucket, which we have not seen before. So even the conversation of having emergency rental assistance is a new one. And I think COVID-19 is really showing that a fund like this is really important for families to have some type of temporary assistance, some type of emergency assistance. So we did get 25 billion in the last COVID-19 relief package that was just passed, but we are asking for 100 billion. And that number is, we're now working to update that number, because when we did that number before last year, we were in a totally different place, and COVID-19 is still impacting a lot of families. So that number will be updated soon. We also asked for 11.5 billion in homeless assistance programs. These programs are really the ones that connect families to the assistance. And so if they don't have any funding, they can't help families. It really reduces the capacity in a lot of these places. So asking for money in order to build capacity, to keep ensuring that people can have the resources that they need, and that they have the people there that could connect them to the resources that they need. We've been pushing for a uniform moratorium on evictions, and we saw a number of extensions of this. The first time it was extended into like half the year, and then it was extended again into December, and now we have another extension into January 31st. And really, we would like to see a uniform moratorium throughout the span of the pandemic, because this just makes sure that families, it's literally the first step. It's like just ensuring that families cannot be kicked out of their homes during this time. But we do need the rental emergency assistance, because without the emergency rental assistance, the rent just keeps accumulating over time. So it's not like during this time families are just getting their rent, being taken care of. The money is being accumulated on the back end with landlords, and so that emergency rental assistance would really help pay some of that back rent. So the first step that we've been advocating for has been the moratorium on evictions, and again, that has been extended a number of times. But we still do need that rental assistance in order to help with the back rent that is just being accumulated over this time, but people not being able to pay their rent. And then we're asking for 10 billion in housing choice vouchers, and this vouchers again allows families to move or to stay in their household, but it provides them that stability through vouchers and that subsidy. The other thing that we really do tackle within the campaign is racial inequities in housing. And so the campaign took a big step last year from the beginning of last year, of just making sure that the racial inequities is really amplified throughout the campaign. And we talk about how the campaign is moving or advancing racial equity. And so just to give a little bit of a broad sense of what's happening with racial inequities in housing, is that we kind of see it in the 5 things that you see here in terms of affordability, segregation, the quality of housing, homelessness, wealth building. And so people of color, Black and brown people, they experience disproportionate impact in all of these areas in terms of affordability, and in terms of segregated communities, and the quality of the housing, and homelessness, and in wealth building. And this has literally been, an issue that has had an impact in the past. It's still very present today. And so sometimes we'll get the question of, how did we get here today? And how we got here is through a lot of racist policies that were enacted before, that really we haven't remedied over time. And so they have these impacts that still impact us today, that create these desperate impacts between racial groups. And then these impacts also feed into other sectors. So if we have a disproportionate impact of housing in certain communities, then there's the effect of how it impacts health and education and your access to food. So again, where you live really drives what resources you have around you. And if communities of color are systematically being denied housing or denied access to quality housing, then that also impacts what healthcare they have access to, the education that they have access to, the grocery stores that they have access to, the transportation that they have access to. And so that's a lot of the stuff that we talk about in the campaign. And at some point, I will walk you through the website where you can find a fact sheet of where we really lay out a lot of this information for folks. And just speaking about how we advance it through the policy agenda. So our policy agenda is really focused on the lowest income renter, and unfortunately, disproportionately, Black and Brown people, they make up a significant number of extremely low income renters. And so through achieving a lot of the policy asks that we have through the policy agenda, we will advance racial equity. But we also do state the campaign is that the campaign is not, that there has to be more work that needs to be done. We're having these conversations and they are new conversations. And so even though our policy agenda does drive the work forward, we are not the end all be all, and we're still thinking through and trying to understand what are some policies or how we can really start looking at different policies in a more targeted lens, if that makes sense. And so through a housing choice voucher, again, expanding the housing choice voucher fund or the National Housing Trust Fund, these programs really do, they are targeted for the extremely low income renter, and that number is a disproportionate impact of Black and Brown people. And so they will, again, reap the benefits of creating those programs. But again, the campaign, we do also advocate for looking at these programs a bit deeper, seeing where we can create better programs that really target racial equity in other ways as well. And so through our campaign, we really do make the effort to talk about how housing touches every aspect of life. As I've talked about throughout the presentation, is that housing really impacts your health, it impacts education, it impacts where you can get food, criminal justice, it impacts all these sectors of life, all these aspects of life. And in our on our website, you'll see that we have a sector page. And on that sector page, we really compile all the research that's out there, all the substantial research that really makes the case that housing is connected to all these issues. And that's, I would say, is a very significant part of the work that we do too, because we pull in our partners to really make the case about housing. And so you can look at those fact sheets, you can print them out, you can use them in your own meetings, your own conferences to really speak about the issue internally, just getting a bunch of the research that's out there, because the research has been out there about how housing connects to everything, but it's also about making sure that folks know where the research is, where to go for the research that really shows that housing is such an important issue for so many of these sectors. And so again, this is the sector pages that you can find on our website that I will walk you through in a second here. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that we do, we've conducted 2 public opinion polls, and for us, these polls were really used to figure out what the public felt about housing, if they felt that housing was a major issue, if housing concerns have changed over time, how people feel about housing during COVID-19, would they like their policymakers to do something about housing? And you will see in our polling results, again, we have that 8 in 10 people in the US say that the president and Congress should take major action to make housing more affordable for low-income households. We have that 2/3 of Americans express concern about how much they pay for housing, with 44% saying that it's a big concern, and it's also broken down so you can see that that concern is pretty high among Black people, among Latinos as well, compared to whites. Renters is a high concern compared to owners, to homeowners. And so our public opinion polls have really had an impact on just showing policymakers too that the public really does see housing as a huge concern that they should be aware of. And in our polling results, we also found that people were very much supportive of the policy agenda that we have through the campaign. So supporting things like expanding the National Housing Trust Fund, creating more vouchers for people, creating a preventative fund for people to access temporary assistance to help them if they ever were to experience the economic shock that might make them spiral. And so before we jump into the questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, but just want to bring you to the website, which, why am I not seeing? Give me a second here. There we go. All right. So just to show you the website, it's opportunityhome.org. If you look on our website, you click this tab right here, you'll find a lot of information about the housing crisis, how it impacts different people, how it impacts, what's the multi-sector impacts of the housing crisis. If you go to this tab right here, the sectors tab is where you'll find those fact sheets that I spoke about. If we go back to the home page, you will go down to this banner right here where you see all the information around housing, housing justice and racial inequities. And it really fleshes out the affordability, segregation, wealth building, all these real issues that are still very much prevalent today. And the last thing that I'll show you before we move on is the Take Action page. And so a lot of folks ask us what we can do to help with the campaign. This is one of the ways, is going to our Take Action page. And right now you can see all of the items that we have are really geared towards COVID-19. So we talk about all of the policies that I talked about around the COVID-19 relief fund. You'll find in this letter right here. We have this letter right here, which was the Emergency Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act that came out last year. And then we have the last one, which was the Bipartisan Pandemic Relief Bill, which was the last thing to be passed, where we had letters sent. So we'll definitely be updating this one over here pretty soon to again get advocates to send letters to Congress around these big bucket housing policies that they should consider for another relief package. And so I'll stop there and I'll answer any questions.
1 second. So we have some questions. Some of them are going to be ones we had selected prior to this. Some of them are going to be ones that are more with recent events, asking questions about the housing crisis. What are some benefits and challenges to building a multi-sector partnership?
So the benefits, and I spoke a bit about them in the presentation. One of the biggest benefits is piquing the interest of policymakers in a different way. Again, if we have a policymaker who housing may not be on their radar, but maybe education is. Maybe they're really, really passionate about health, right? But if we send a letter from Opportunity Starts at Home that shows that all of these healthcare organizations really find that housing resources would really help in their work, it really gives a different view for the policymaker about how housing can really connect to these issues and how they can really pivot to really focusing on housing policy, and that they would have the support from healthcare groups that are saying that housing is very important to their own issue. And we've done that throughout the campaign too. Like sometimes we do pick out a sector and we do ask them specifically like, hey, we know this person is really interested in this issue right here. They're working on this bill right here that's talking about this particular issue, but can you help us through the campaign talk about how housing is truly connected to that issue, right? So they help us in that way too. They also really do help us with the research that's out there around housing. And so housing research, we talk about, where the affordability is, where the where the stock is, where the availability is when it comes to the housing crisis. But our multi-sector partners really do help us with expanding the research to show how housing impacts all these different sectors. And so we have all these other talking points now to really address the housing crisis, because it's really not just a housing crisis. It really spills over to all these other sectors as well. And so the ways that it becomes challenging is that with the organizations that are partners with our campaign, they're not bread and butter housing organizations. So they have their own capacity. And so it really is helpful for them to have staff. There's 2 staff dedicated to the campaign, myself and Mike Kaprowski, that do this work all day, right? So they lean on our capacity a lot to help them focus on the housing issue, because they're focused on whatever other issue that they're focused on at the time, whether it be racial inequities that's their bread and butter, or education that their bread and butter, or health. Having the capacity of staff in the campaign is helpful, but we also do they also do have a lack of capacity for like dedicating all of their time to housing, because their work is not in the housing space. The other thing I would say too is that sometimes we're talking in different languages. So since these sectors have been siloed for so long, we've created like a whole bunch of many words, a complete dictionary in all these different sectors. And so sometimes bringing in other sectors is also trying to like make sure that we're not as weedy. So that's why I said during the presentation that we really did have to keep our policy buckets really high level in order to mobilize other sectors so that they understand what we're talking about. Like if we break down the housing crisis as a demand supply prevention issue, it's kind of easy for other sectors to understand what that means. Like, okay, we need rental subsidies for housing. We need more housing. We need to build more housing. We need a temporary assistance program. Like that's pretty easy for folks to pick up. But we know that if we get really weedy into housing policy, we lose the mobilizing that happens with trying to get more housing resources. So definitely a barrier for us sometimes can be the language as well. So there's definitely challenges. There's challenges to building the partnership, but the benefits outweigh any of the challenges that we have. And I would say that it's really about working around the challenges. Sometimes that means that for us is going back to the drawing board and just figuring out with our partners what language works. A lot of the times that's what we do too. We ask them like, what's the language that really works with your network, your membership? How do you get them to mobilize? What is it that you use that we can use in the housing space that would get them, right? Sometimes a lot of that is also the research, just pulling out like, this is the impact that it has on children. This is the impact that it has on your health. This is the impact that it has in school systems in general, in healthcare systems. In the case of economic mobility, this is how much money we're losing when we don't address housing. And so a lot of that is also just working with the multi-sector partnerships in order to eliminate or reduce some of the challenges that we have with the work.
So you talk about public opinion polling. How has that shaped the work that you do?
Yeah, so when we thought about the public opinion poll, we didn't even really realize the impact that it was going to have when we released it. But the first one that we released, it really had a widespread impact because it showed that the public had really shifted over time. So when we did our first opinion poll, it was 3 years since one had been done before. And the one that was done before was, it was a little bit more simple. It was really a little bit more high level. It wasn't really talking about the policies itself, but people weren't really thinking about it in a 3-year span. So when we did the poll 3 years later again, and we put a little bit more questions in there. We even asked about these policies to see that we had results that were 85%, 90%, and this was across also political affiliation. So high numbers of Republicans, conservative Republicans, Democrats, just independents across the board. People were saying that housing was a major concern and that they wanted to see members of Congress, they wanted to see their president really address housing issues, and that they were on board with a lot of the policies that we thought maybe people wouldn't be on board with these policies because they're targeted to extremely low income renters. But we saw that people really felt like these were policies that were achievable and needed to be done. And now, even with COVID-19 again exacerbating a lot of these issues, people are seeing it even more that housing is so critical. I mean, we're in a major pandemic where the number one thing is for people to be housed. And if you cannot be stably housed, or if you are homeless and you do not have a home, how can you really, how can you effectively, carry on in a pandemic of such, right, of such nature when the number one thing is for people to stay stably housed? So I think people are definitely becoming more and more aware of housing becoming an issue. But even before the pandemic, the public was recognized housing as a major issue. And that had been a complete transformation from 3 years prior, when it was literally around half the public had identified housing as a major issue. But from going to like half the public to like 80%, 90%, and a lot of our questions, is really transformational to see that housing is becoming an issue that is becoming a national priority. And we definitely saw it during the presidential debates, during trying to secure a nominee. A lot of the Democratic candidates were speaking about housing. They were talking about the shortage of supply. They were talking about the need to bridge the gap between rents and incomes. They were speaking about putting major amounts of money in their housing plans in some of these policies that really people hadn't been talking about for a while. So we are seeing a lot of the landscape change around housing policy and
Okay,
awareness. Yeah.
now we have some questions about more things that are, I guess, more recent. Um, so obviously we have a new administration. Are there any policies want them to enact or revoke from the Trump administration or any previous administrations?
Well, through the campaign, we will be asking for what we've recognized that this is a major moment, that in this moment we can talk about the big bucket issues that we have been talking about in real ways. The Biden administration even came out with its own kind of ambitious housing plan, so it's even pushing that even further. The possibilities have widened. And so through the Trump administration, even though the campaign, this is a little bit outside of the scope of the campaign itself, because Enelight C's work is really focused on all of the buckets in terms of housing policy and how it impacts low-income renters. So through the Trump administration, there were a lot of policies that we had to be a little bit more on the defensive side in terms of Enelight C's work, with some of the policies that were coming out of the Trump administration that were going to restrict housing for certain groups of people, was going to have an impact on the funding of some of these programs, cutting back on the funding of some of these programs. So there was a lot of work to defend a lot of the programs that were there. And now with this new administration and this new look of Congress, there is this conversation that we are having now about how ambitious can we be in terms of pushing for some of our housing policies. And the Opportunity Starts at Home agenda was already ambitious to start with. We're talking about policies that really focus on the lowest income renter, and that also entails really talking about a group of people that a lot of people have a certain narrative about already, right? So really transforming that kind of conversation is one of itself very ambitious, but now we're even looking at the policies that we have through Opportunity Starts at Home, which are already ambitious, but thinking about how much more resources we might be able to talk about. You know, as I mentioned, with COVID-19, we had emergency assistance was something that we weren't even talking about really. We had just introduced a bipartisan bill at the end of 2019 that talked about emergency assistance. So it was slightly on the radar, but now we see that it really is an important bucket of funding that is needed for families. I would say that it has tremendously really brought emergency assistance to the forefront as well. And so I think that in this new administration, although we still are divided, like, you know, there's a 50-50 split in the Senate. So it's not as if there's still like those considerations as well. But there is some room here that we're thinking through as an organization of how we can be more ambitious. And we're leaning on our research team to look into more numbers, and we're leaning in on our policy team too, and just trying to figure out what we might want to ask for through the campaign. So that's why I also said the policy agenda we're working on now, we're having those conversations, and it might look a bit different now that the political landscape is a bit different.
Okay. So what is the best way to start pursuing the policies of the campaign on the state, local level, or lobbying at the congressional level?
So I would say, so the two ways in which, if you would do it through the campaign, I would say is going to our Take Action page, is sending letters. If you wanted to expand it a lot more, again, I would say follow the National Low Income Housing Coalition. NLIC, they have their newsletters, they do a bunch of call to actions. So I would follow us, Opportunity Starts at Home. I would say follow the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They do a lot of call-in days as well. And then also, in order to really focus on some on the state level, if you live in a state that we do have a state campaign in, connecting with those organizations, they do a lot of that work on the ground. A lot of the housing organizations that we partner with are really the leading voice in housing policy in their state. So we would say go and contact members, those organizations. Opportunity Starts at Home, we have a limited group of state partners that we have right now, but you can also go to the National Low Income Housing Coalition that has a bigger bucket of state coalitions that are working on this issue as well. So I would say, again, follow the National Low Income Housing Coalition, look at our state partners and make sure that you contact them, follow the work that they're doing. And if you are interested in more of the multi-sector piece of it, definitely follow us at Opportunity Starts at Home, connect to our affiliates as well. And we're always able to answer questions, get you connected if there's something specific that you want to do. We have a lot of connections from member organizations that are multi-sector and the housing organizations that are affiliated with us as well.
Our last question is, so you talked a little bit about COVID-19 relief. Does the Opportunity Starts at Home, what bill do they support, or do they support a stronger and more comprehensive?
Well, so there's been bills that have come out that we've supported, but mostly it's the 4 asks that I brought up before. So we are asking for, again, a uniform moratorium on evictions. We're asking for 100 billion in emergency assistance. We're talking about 11.5 billion in homeless assistance funding. So those have been the big buckets that we have been asking for, is what's been our push. So we haven't necessarily, if there's a bill that comes out that's in line with the ask that we have with the campaign, we've been supporting those bills, but mostly we've just been pushing for those specific lines to be in any new relief package that we've had. And again, we've been able to push the eviction moratorium, extend it and keep extending it. Again, we just got 25 billion for emergency assistance. So we are seeing some of the policy priorities that we have. We are seeing them reflected in the relief package, but we continue to ask for the numbers that we're asking for, because we've done the research. If you look at NLIC's website, you'll see the research done that shows why we're asking for those specific numbers, that we've done the research and this is the need that's happening now. And we will update them, because again, when we did a lot of that research, it was in 2020 and now we're in 2021 and the landscape might be different. The need we suspect may be even greater. And so we'll be updating those numbers, but that's what we've been asking for throughout the pandemic, is really our 4 priority asks. And again, we've seen a bit of our asks. We've seen them reflected in the relief package, but we're going to continue to push for the full ask for relief for folks, for housing relief.
Well, it was wonderful having you, Chantal, to talk about the housing crisis. And that wraps up our session on the housing crisis.